Everybody, welcome to Session C, Punk Sex and Punk Gender. Ooh. As a reminder, each panelist has 15 minutes, and I'm one of your co-moderators, Luke Hernandez, and your other co-moderator, B. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, I am B. My thesis is about tangentially punk, sex, and gender, so I'm very excited to be co-modding this panel. Bring on the punk, sex, and gender. Great to see old and new faces here. Um, rock on! I'm so hyped. Stay analog.
Thank you for that, B. B will send you a message if you go over your time. We're trying to keep our times, and we're filling in for Shelly. She's with us digitally, but she'll be popping in and out. So without much further ado, our first set of papers is Megan and James. Take it away, please. Thank you.
Right. So, perfect. My name is Megan Condis, and I'm going to be presenting this paper along with Walker Holmes. We are calling this paper Rolling with Masculinity, Analyzing Male Players' Identity Construction in Tabletop Role-Playing. In the last couple of days, I've actually been playing around with an alternate title. So this paper might be called One is Not Born, but rather Becomes a Chaotic Good Half-Orc Barbarian. So feedback welcome in the Discord. So this paper was born out of a collaboration with the Understanding Masculinities in Gaming cohort, which is led by Professor Christina Jurgensen at the University of Bergen in Norway. And it was born out of a discussion that we were having about the fact that there have been a lot of studies of gender identity in tabletop RPGs, kind of tracking the ways in which players express their gender or their sexuality through gameplay. So how they kind of explore their identities using game mechanics at the table while in character. But a lot of these studies have focused on gender and sexual minorities, and a very small number of them have actually focused on the way that people enact masculinity at the table. And in some ways, this makes a lot of sense because, as many critics have pointed out, including many folks who are here in this conference, a lot of these tabletop role-playing games are kind of organized around particular versions of masculinity that are, kind of run rampant through fantasy literature and then through the kind of tabletop role-playing scene. And there's this assumption in a lot of these studies that um, it is kind of transparent or it is known what it is like to enact a masculine identity at the table that is sort of like built into the game system already, and that the thing that is puzzling or questionable or needs to be revealed is the experience of enacting other identities. But we kind of wanted to question or trouble that assumption and ask, is it actually true that the enactment of masculinity via role-playing games is this sort of like simple, direct, uncomplicated relationship? And so my research partner, Walker, and I kind of conceived of this study with two research questions in mind. So first, we asked ourselves, how do tabletop RPG players conceptualize masculinity in the first place? What do they understand masculinity to be? And then second, how do these players express masculine identities using the mechanics of TTRPGs? So how do identities come to be transformed into stats and feats and the things that you would use in order to play a tabletop RPG? And so our method was that we wanted to conduct in-depth interviews via Zoom with folks who identified as male, who were over 18 years of age, and who had self-identified as having a great deal of experience with tabletop RPGs. We did a sort of pre-interview survey, and if you answered yes to all three of those questions, then you were invited to participate. We recruited for this study in a couple of different ways. So locally at our university, we put up flyers. We traveled to local game stores. We also recruited online. So we went to various subreddits dedicated to TTRPGs and looked for people who would be interested to talk to us. And then from there, we used a snowball sampling method to ask the folks that we interviewed if they could recommend any friends or family members that they thought might be interested in participating in the study. So the interview had 3 parts. We had a little pre-interview section where we asked the participants about their experiences in tabletop, like how many years have they been playing, what games are they familiar with. And then we asked participants how they defined masculinity. So, what does being a man mean to them? We asked them where they learned about what it means to be a man, and we asked them what expectations they thought society had for people who were identified as male. And then after that, we got to the fun part of the interview. So the interview's main kind of thrust was going through the character creation process with a specific prompt in mind. So we used Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition because we figured it would be the system that folks were most familiar with. And we asked them to build out a brand new character that exemplified what masculinity means to them. And in order to do that, we kind of walked them through the process of building out a character, kind of one question at a time, asking them to pick a species, asking them to pick a class, asking them to assign stats, an alignment, and a background. And in each step of the process, when they would give an answer, we would ask them, why did you choose that? Why does that choice in character development kind of mean masculinity to you? And then at the end of the process, in the post-interview section, we asked the participants to reflect on the character that they built and to talk about, what they enjoyed about the process, what was maybe frustrating about the process. Would they actually play with the character that they built, and questions like that. And unfortunately, because of our time constraints, we're going to kind of go through these results quickly, but I'm very happy to share the PowerPoint to anyone who's curious, because we have some tables and some charts. And if you're like me and you like to get into the weeds, you might want to check those out. But just to let you know, so we conducted a total of 22 interviews. We lost one interview to the technological goblins who ate it up. And so we actually ended up having 21 interview transcripts to work with. We looked at we did a thematic analysis of those transcripts to look for emerging topics that many of the participants discussed. And then we also analyzed trends and the mechanical choices the interviewees made during the character creation process. And what we came up with was this. So I took the liberty of using Hero Forge to make a little visual mock-up of each of the characters that our interviewees created. And again, so if you want to look at this more closely, I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint. But here's what we discovered about what the character that they built. So first, in terms of the species that were chosen, there was a big wide distribution, although definitely kind of indexing more heavily into the larger built characters. So the dwarfs, the half-orcs, the dragonborns, and even a few that were kind of outside of the typical hero species and getting into maybe some of the more monster species like Goliath. In terms of class, again, there was a pretty wide dispersal, but definitely leaning more heavily towards the more kind of close combat classes and less heavily into magic, although there were a few clerics and a few rangers up there. And then this is, I think, something that was really interesting. In terms of the ability scores, these are the average scores across all of the respondents, what they tended to index into. So we used a sort of standard distribution. We didn't roll for stats because we didn't want someone to roll a god or roll someone, a very ineffectual character, and that would skew everything. So they had sort of set numbers to distribute. And we saw that while strength was definitely the most favored stat, everything else kind of came in close to one another together. And another way to visualize this would be to look at the ways, the number of respondents who gave each answer for a score. So you can see, and this again, like if you want to look at this more closely, I'd be happy to share, but you can kind of see how many people tended to give low scores to a particular stat, how many people tended to give high scores, and kind of how that was distributed. So you'd see like most people tended to give strength a very high score, very few people gave strength the lowest possible score of 8, whereas things like dexterity, constitution, intelligence, more people tended to give that the lowest possible score, and fewer people tended to give it the highest possible score. And then a couple more things in the results here. So there was, again, a pretty wide distribution in terms of alignments that were picked, although definitely very, very much indexing towards the good side of D&D alignment, but a lot of indecision about whether we want to be lawful, whether we want to be neutral, or whether we want to be chaotic. And one respondent who wanted to start the campaign as an evil aligned character, but kind of imagined the campaign being about that character evolving and learning. So that was kind of interesting. And then lastly, in terms of background here, we had a lot of the characters who indexed into kind of protective backgrounds. So soldier, guard, folk hero, folks who are kind of putting themselves on the wall between society and the people that need to be protected. And that kind of brings us into some of the themes that arose during our interviews. So one big theme that emerged over the course of our interviews was this question of, when you ask me, what do I think masculinity is? Are you asking me what I as an individual think it is? Or are you asking me what society at large thinks that it is? And that split came up in almost every single interview, that there was this idea that it actually wasn't kind of simple or straightforward to define masculinity, and that there was kind of an existing idea that maybe is like a popular idea or an idea kind of fostered by mass culture, and that might not be the idea that these folks wanted to subscribe to. So we have quotes like, there are just some standards being in the cultural milieu that we are in, where masculinity kind of looks a certain way, where it's somewhat performative, where being masculine means being into sports and being rough and tumble. Another common theme that came out, which is kind of in alignment with the statistical information that we got, was that strength is a big thing with regards to masculinity. Not necessarily just physical strength, like being bigger is equal to being stronger and stronger is equal to being masculine, but also mental and emotional strength. So being able to be of use to other people, being tasked with using your strength to help others, was a really important part of being masculine. Protecting others was also a big theme. So being selfless, being someone for someone else, being able to protect those around you was a big theme with regards to how these people imagined masculinity in everyday life, and then also manifesting in the game. It's strong, it's protective, protecting the weak and like the righteous. And then one theme that was kind of surprising was this theme that masculinity was about having feet in multiple different worlds, or having to balance different sets of expectations. That being a man meant having to kind of weigh the expectations or the needs or the desires of others against your own, and having to try to navigate and balance between taking care of yourself and taking care of others. And that often manifested in folks talking about species and saying, I wanted to pick a half-orc character or a half-elf character or a tiefling character that is maybe at odds with the human society of Dungeons and Dragons, and that has to kind of navigate different sets of social expectations. And that they saw that as a metaphor for masculinity. And then interestingly enough, and this is where my co-presenter Walker is going to take over, we had two participants who named punk culture as one of the places that they learned to be a man from. And so in keeping with the theme of our conference here, Walker's going to talk a little bit about how punk influences people's ideas of gender.
Awesome, thank you. It was kind of crazy and in a way fortunate, without prompting, mentioning their punk influences. It was the first two interviews that I got to do, and it was kind of crazy, kind of coming into these situations, and especially, I guess you could say, I'm your average half-orc paladin, and so coming in and talking to other guys like me who played D&D and stuff, to hear about how the type of music they listen to influenced what they did, especially without prompt. And what was really fun was talking how that influenced their interpretation of gender and stuff like that. So we see here Zal had a very similar background to myself. Funny enough, we were the same age, about the same place in our lives. But then when he started talking about how he viewed gender, he talked about how when he got into the punk scene in college, it didn't just show him that he could be whoever it showed him that he wasn't locked into just being himself or being what other people saw him as. He could be anything he wanted to be. And the fun quote that one of the fun quotes we have here is, be whatever gender you want, you could be whatever alignment you want, which is so interesting because those two things are not, well, I don't think anybody would consider those related, but to think about the mechanical support and the way that you kind of see that as framed to be literally any spectrum, anything you want to be on, you can be anywhere on it. And so just a very cool, but also while it is fighting against that power, it's also very community focused and it's very tight. Like you want to be supportive of other people being open and being who they want to be. For instance, while it is anti-establishment, and while that does fight against a lot of the established norms, there's still that strong sense of community. Like it says here, there's a strong sense of community of being yourself and just kind of, and they talk about putting it into the music, but if we could quickly get to the next individual, and there was just some very good quotes from Zal. Oh, overshot a little bit. But Trig, who we actually saw, we referenced earlier very briefly, had a very interesting background because not only did they come out of the UK punk scene, the United Kingdom punk scene, which was really cool, but that experience transitioned into the British Navy, where they spent a lot of time at sea. And so they said they believed that anybody could be whatever they wanted. They believed that masculinity isn't fixed. It can be challenged and it can be reconsidered. And they actually transitioned that into a very structured life where they considered, I learned about self-reliance from punk, but then when I got into the military and started living very close to other people, it just kind of reinforced it. So what was really cool about both of them was that first, it wasn't just like, it wasn't a phase, it was something that really affected them and wasn't just a framework, but something that shifted their life view. And then also the first Zal, I believed that the system was very masculine. When we asked, it was like, do you think that the system did a good job helping you support masculinity? He said, well, of course it did. It's D&D. Like D&D is incredibly masculine. And then the second individual, Trig, said, well, it's just, that's the meaning you put on it, like it's not inherently masculine, but you can still support masculinity very well here. So it was really cool to talk to two people where punk organically came up, and they did a fantastic job, I think, representing that and how it evolved as they moved on. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And please, if you have questions for us, we'd love to see them in the Discord. I'll be sharing the PowerPoint there for anyone who wants to dive a little more deeply into the numbers. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan and James. Y'all were on a roll. So next up is Keerthi. Can you please share your screen?
Alrighty. Yeah, will do.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone cross your fingers for audio again. Here we go.
Hi folks, I hope everyone's having a lovely morning / afternoon / evening. My name's Keerthi Sridharan. I'm a PhD candidate in games and player experience at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and today I'm going to be talking about sex, in perhaps the least raunchy way possible. I'm specifically going to dive into sex in actual plays using 3 quote-unquote sex scenes from 3 different actual plays, and explore what it means to do sex in an actual play setting for performers, viewers, and players. So my dissertation is on knowledge production and counterplay in historical video games, but by trade I'm a sociolinguist, and I've spent quite some time looking into language use in TTRPGs and in actual plays specifically. I draw a lot from theater and performance studies in my work, improv and props, and I'm very interested in humor as its own kind of magic circle from all of these lenses, a frame in which certain utterances and behaviors become not only allowable and permissible, but also survivable, right? I work from a framework of understanding that a lot of us don't simply happen to be funny, but have to be funny. I'll breeze past the sort of why actual play part of it a little bit, because we're among the experts that have told us in no uncertain terms why actual play is worthy of study. But I'll say briefly that I'm interested in APs as entry points and gateways in the ways that they function as quasi-exemplars for what tabletop should look like for a lot of player communities. I'd also like to situate actual plays as a mechanism or mode through which certain discursive practices, rules, etiquette, norms of behavior are authenticated and canonized such that they hold weight in home game contexts. I'm specifically seeing this as analogous to Eugen Pfister's idea of discursive myths in historical video games, where once an idea is depicted in a historically accurate setting, it is placed outside the realm of question. Its credibility and historicity isn't up for debate anymore. Last bit of contextualizing is that this talk was conceived of in the midst of an ongoing and long overdue conversation about intimacy and safety on movie sets. A lot of the different lines of discussion here are, to me, very relevant to actual play, specifically the idea that safety inhibits authentic performance and takes away from the final product. And this conversation is happening in parallel with discussions in the tabletop community between designers and players alike on consent and safety tools, specifically with regard to the stigma and lack of accountability and consistency around their use and misuse. So on one hand, we have the sort of externalization of safety to a third party, and on the other hand, we have the idea of safety as an individually bounded and negotiated practice where the onus is on the player. APs as both performed mediated products and attempts at depicting authentic tabletop play are an ideal site to ask these questions around because they sort of seesaw between these 2 points. So with that all established, my goal today is to illustrate the productive potential of sex in actual play performances in 3 modes that point to futures for doing sex in actual play and at our tables at home. Sex as bit, sex as deviation, and sex as freedom. First up, we have a scene from Campaign 2 of Critical Role. The party has just met an imposing figure, illustrated here on the right, and Not, played by Sam Riegel in the red shirt, expresses sexual desires towards this NPC. Let's take a look.
I have had many names through many lives, but the one I take now is Sunbreaker Ullman.
Sunbreaker Ullman?
Ullman. And
Ullman.
is there a Mrs. Sunbreaker? Or
You flirting with the fucking Minotaur?
he's fucking hot. And, 50-50, my husband's dead, so. Wow.
We've been sending him messages every night.
Behind enemy lines.
The massive Minotaur looks down at the goblin with a curled eyebrow and goes,
No.
whoa, don't make any messes. And he turns around.
Pleasure.
Oh my god.
I like
Did you
it
see
here.
the way? I think he winked at you. I think he winked at you. I think I saw.
I couldn't tell through his piercing eyes. Those were his horns were piercing. His horns not. Stay on task. I'm sorry.
How much time, keep in mind?
About 15 to 20.
At this point, about 15 minutes or so before we should.
Let's head into the livery and
All right.
see if there's a conversation.
What was his name? Ullman.
Sunbreaker.
Oloman.
Ullman.
Knotbreaker Ullman.
Oh, no.
Anyway,
Like a gerbil on a banana.
So, as you can see, this is the kind of sex we're used to seeing in an actual play context. It's also the most easily replicated kind of sex to do in a home game setting. A classic D&D sex joke, scare quotes. The group enters a humorous conversational mode. There are minimal consequences for the utterances that they say in character, and there's a latent assumption that normal play will be right back following the establishment of the bit. If you're familiar with this campaign, you'll know that this specific bit, returns in several subsequent episodes. And there are a few things I want to note here about the whys of this bit working. Sam is playing a married goblin mother whose husband the party's looking for, as stated. The sexualization of the undersexualized here, along the axes of mother, goblin, and female character played by male player, are all unexpected subversions leveraged here for humor. There is a reading of this as a kind of sexual liberation and empowerment for this character, but suffice it to say that that's not the conclusion I jumped to. Like I said, this is a very recognizable, replicable mode of sex in actual play, an unexpected departure from the narrative, and the narrative here is situated outside of the humorous mode. So we leave it to do the humor and then we come back. Second, we have a scene from Season 2 of Dungeons & Daddies, another 5e campaign. For context, Beth, a player, has just drawn an item card from a deck containing fan-submitted and GM-created items.
Except for the item that Beth is about to draw.
Ooh. Beth is pulling an orange card.
What did you get?
Oh my god, okay, wait, what? Okay. The Kellogg knife. There's like a gap between the K and the... A 1d4 blade that gets 1d4 more damaging every week / episode, you don't masturbate.
As
Now,
a character?
hold on.
It says right there it's a wisdom saving throw every episode.
So which one of us should take that?
Well, I mean, I don't, so I guess I'll take it.
It might be too, it might be too powerful if I take it, because
Listen, I'm gonna take the knife,
Okay.
and I'm like cool enough that even if it doesn't get more damaging, I will still be powerful.
It's scary. Don't worry,
I'm
uncomfortable talking about this. Let's move on.
Agent Hale says, like, she's a girl and we don't have sexual desires,
No,
so she's definitely gonna keep
I'm not gonna look. I'm not gonna look when you use the knife, so I'm not gonna know how powerful it was. Don't worry. I'm. So we're all good to still.
Is there just hypothetically though? I'm just floating this. Is there like the opposite of that knife? Because I think that we can decide.
So what's interesting to me about this scene is that it mechanically punishes a player for a sex act, which takes this idea of sex as something that happens outside of the narrative a step further. It disallows it, right? It establishes a barrier. In doing so, it also reinforces, obviously, a certain idea of what the emergent play is allowed or supposed to be. This item is a weapon meant to enact harm on hypothetical villains and monsters that will do so more effectively if the character wielding it does not masturbate. Whether they do or not is also not an agentive decision by the player about their character, but a dice roll, a wisdom saving throw specifically, positioning masturbation as a sort of failure of willpower and a giving in to a baser caveman urge. This, of course, contrasted against the rationalist, objective-oriented play that would prioritize killing monsters and moving the story forward. This is in line with Ruberg's work on straight rails and Shovik Mukherjee's discussion of success in games as being predicated on conquest rhetoric. Something I like about this, though, is Beth's response, highlighted in red here, which to me is a pretty sick refusal of the mechanic. She's happy to keep her 1d4 blade a 1d4 blade, which offsets the pressure of the mechanic. It can't be used to put her back on rails. But as presented and as played, this knife presents sex as self-sabotage, as a deviation from what should happen. There's a heavily gendered aspect to this as well, made explicit by the male GM and quasi-canonized through his female NPC, May Hales. That's here in black. This scene is funny because it establishes mechanical consequences for behavior not typically operationalized in the system. And therefore, while sex is outside of the narrative, it still establishes masturbation in the narrative space of play, even if it is very narrowly. So our third case is Dropouts Never Stop Blowing Up, which uses a system of the same name based on Kids on Bikes. In the scene we're about to see, player Ifiwadiwe has just triggered a move in which a player is allowed to take the GM seat for 60 seconds on the clock. This is the first of a few times that this move is triggered.
Dude, you're so fucking cool. We fucking love Vic Ethanol. Here's my gun. They give him the gun. They give Kingskin the halberd. They're like, here, y'all go in. Y'all have a good fucking time. And as a matter of fact, if anyone comes in here looking for you, we're gonna fucking kill them. So they're fucking dead. They're fucking dead. And they say, just so you know, if anyone touches Jennifer Trips, Vic Ethanol, Kingskin, Jack Manhattan, and this greasy guy, G13, you're fucking dead. That's the new rules of the club. They go on Greg Stocks. Greg Stocks. Greg Stocks. They go on the intercom and they're like, yeah, Greg Stocks.
You got 4 seconds, do something cool.
And then they come.
Oh my fucking god.
Hey, is anyone out there? Well, kill them!
All right, just didn't want you to run out of
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
I want you to know you're
incredible.
I cannot believe that bit me in the ass right away. Right away. So you see, yeah, as you walk through the door, each of them bent over, holding their crotch, going, ah!
He was so hot. They led it.
So, especially compared to our first two examples, this scene's a little off the rails. Even before sex comes into it, there's a power upset and a sense of total agency over the narrative. The sex comes into play in response to the request from another PC to do something cool. The choice is then immediately canonized by the other players and the GM. There's no entering and exiting the humorous mode here. It's just a positioning of sex as an unexpected, subversive player action. It is, of course, wildly funny, but it is not a bit or an aside. It is part of the story's narrative. Something I also think is great is that in further episodes, anytime this move is triggered, the everybody comes line gets reintroduced. Again, not as a bit, but as a real thing that happens in the narrative. Committing to the bit of sex is here a reward given to the players by the players. That to me cements it as a mode where sex is sort of emblematic of player freedoms. So we've looked at these three examples, and unfortunately I'm bound by the constraints of linearity, so there's an implied trajectory here, right? The primitive bit to the mechanized deviation to the utopian freedom. I reject that out of hand, for the record. Again, a lot of us are funny because we have to be within the bounds and rules of what we have available to us. Everybody comes is not always something that we have available to us. There's a lot of productive potential for study here, is my point, across all three of these modes and even further. My goal with presenting these in this order is to illustrate that actual play can at times be a safer place to commit to the bit of sex than in other environments, and I'm interested in the whys of that. Maybe it's that externalization of safety, maybe it's that performed element, right? Performance, like humor, puts a frame of liminality around transgressive play. There are a number of other modes of sex that I think could also be explored here, namely sex as denial, refusal, killing the vibe, and sex as a hyper-normalized inevitable fact of play in certain story world environments as a kind of fidelity to setting or genre. And there are, of course, many more. I take a very Janelle Monáe / Michel Foucault approach to sex, which is to say that this is and always has been a conversation about safety, right? Actual play is also a conversation about safety. Specifically safety and interaction. APs have fostered a very specific kind of parasociality that carries echoes of YouTuber and theater fandom spaces of the 2010s, this idea of a simultaneous person product. Some of these performers are married. Many of them are close friends, making products built off of the success and longevity of these friendships. Parasociality also affords liminality, which in turn affords boundary crossing and commentary on the practices of the actual play. What I mean by this is that thing I said at the beginning, this process of discursive myths being authenticated and canonized in actual play is a mediated process. It's negotiated through interactions with fans and players and within fandom spaces. Returning again to safety more literally, the tools that are implemented in many actual play productions, such as content warnings, links to relevant resources and hotlines, fandom discussion spaces themselves, and sensitivity readers and consultants, those aren't always feasible or accessible in home settings, right? I feel like sex in tabletop could be a useful way to look at externalizing safety, not to tools and third parties, but perhaps externalizing it to systems and allowances in what we can have players do. At the same time, there's this line of thinking that, and I'm quoting my friend and colleague Matt Coward-Gibbs here, the best safety tool is the value set of the people you're playing with. It's echoed here as well in this quote from an interview with designer Kazumi Chin. Safety, here the keeping oneself safe through detachment and not fully committing, is enacted at the expense of authentic play for the player, right? Suffice it to say, I'm not making sex jokes at every table I sit down at. Sex and humor through it is another practice that emerges through trust. What I'm wondering, though, is what that means for conventions, for pickup games, for game nights at your friendly local game store. Beyond house rules and community values, what does it mean to externalize safety and protect ourselves when you aren't playing with lifelong friends? That's an open question that I'll leave you with because I don't have an answer so much as a direction, and that direction would be to explore new ways to foster that trust. Thanks so much for your time. If you'd like to dive into some of the stuff I've talked about today, bibliography is up here, and I'm contactable at any of these addresses below.
Thank you so much, Keerthi. That was fire. Next up is PB and Percy. PB and Percy, can you take it away?
Perfect. Yeah. Give me just a second to put all the windows in all the right places. All right. Can everybody see the thing? Cool. Move my speaker view super quick. And off we go. A candle's flame winks out as the last of the wax burns down, leaving Percy alone on his bedroom floor, surrounded by chalk smudges and crushed peppercorns. It's November 2020. Percy has administered his first shot of testosterone earlier today, marking the beginning of a new stage in his transition.
In this moment, however, he is a teenage girl and a witch. The spell he's finished casting is called Secret Beauty, meant to help witches let go of the hate they feel for themselves. For Percy, this hate takes the form of inarticulable feelings about masculinity, being trans in a sometimes hostile world, and saying goodbye to the teenage girl he once was and for this fleeting moment embodies once more. Engaging in the act of play at this pivotal moment loosens the boundaries of what is fictional and what is real in ways that make space for transformation and catharsis. Crucially, this act of lyrical play blends dream and reality without prescribing a particular shape for that transformation to take. In starting HRT and in becoming a teen witch, Percy accepts an invitation to step into something unknown.
Percy is playing Avery Alder's teen witch, which is rooted in a simple truth. That something is fiction doesn't make it any less real. In order to play, you must convince yourself that you are a teenage girl who is also a witch, at least for the duration of a session of the game. As he plays, Percy takes solace in the lack of definition, of certainty, of stable objects on which to build his sense of who he is and who he will become. He proceeds on the strength of the fact that it feels right to him, even if he can't articulate exactly why.
Hi, friends. I'm Percy. This is PB, and our talk is called Liches, Lampreys, and the Moon, an incantation for trans life and lyrical play. This talk is not a talk. The paper it's based on is not a paper. It is a riposte, a game, a spell, a manifesto, an opening of a ritual circle, one that we invite you into. We are gathering to cast secret beauty so that we might learn to let go of the objects around which we build our work and our field, and in so doing, make them real.
We first turned to lyric games and their kinship with trans life in our contribution to the recent special issue of the Analog Games Journal focused on queer analog game studies. We called for a lyrical approach to the work of field building in response to the special issue's call for a queerer analog game studies, drawing on the relationships lyric games build with their players and the movement that has coalesced around their creation and design.
We wrote the piece because we are thinking about field building and about legibility and about the ways that the queer games movement of the 2010s, as much groundwork as it laid for crucial interventions in game studies, ultimately created a narrower definition of queer and of game and of studies than the folks behind it were intending. We aren't getting into details, we aren't naming names, but when the special issue invited us to imagine what a queerer future for analog game studies looks like, our response was to theorize a playful relation to our subfield itself, to our work as writers and scholars and makers.
We asked ourselves, what might it look like to approach queer analog game studies playfully, to build relations to our objects of study and to the field with all its institutional solemnity that themselves embody an entangled spirit of disavowal and deviant creative destruction.
This brings us to our key subject today. We contend that lyrical play and the creation of lyric games offer us a model for doing trans and queer scholarship in game studies, in part because lyric operates in much the same way trans often does, as a destabilizing force that erodes its own container without fear of what will happen when the objects that make it legible are gone.
Lyrical play is a trans mode of play in its commitment to unraveling and mutability, unstable, flickering, resistant to fixed interpretation. To trans, something is to be in playful relation to it, to adopt a new stance toward the objects that mediate our interaction with the world, one that makes those objects something to play with rather than revere.
To be in playful relation to our field then asks us to work without the kind of reverence that leads to stagnation and with openness to finding something unexpected in the ruins of seemingly stable objects like queer, analog, and game.
The ongoing lyric game movement represents the most experimental and radical site of exploration for queer analog play. It encompasses games that eat other games, games that are one word long, anti-games, and games that are not games but rather poems and manifestos and found photos and performances and all manner of mixed media art.
Attempting to define lyric games is not only Sisyphean, but violates the very ethos of lyric game design. Jay Dragon, in an interview with game designer Logan Timmons, argues that lyric game design is best understood as a community movement and a joint investment in experimental methodology. This is what a lot of people outside of lyric games get wrong, is that it's not a genre, it's a movement. Every definition I've seen is unsatisfactory. Instead, I'm interested in like, this is a shared creative movement, or like it's an elaborate conversation happening between many people over the course of multiple years.
Also, hi, Jay.
Hi, Jay.
These works occupy a confounding cultural position. Lyric games are increasingly popular among players and designers, and yet there are no lyric games. On the one hand, Dragon and scholars like Jordan Magnuson claim that there is no governed genre of what is and isn't a lyric game. But on the other hand, Magnuson's recent volume Game Poems still serves as an academic overview of lyric video games as a genre. And similarly, Dragon, in the description for Altar Boys and Heretics, despite disavowing definitions of lyric games, describes the project as a collection of lyric games and even includes a definition, describing them as an emerging genre of games on itch.io that interrogate what it means for a game to be playable and in turn proposes its own answers.
The term lyric game is neither a critical taxonomy nor a legible marketing genre. It is a wink and a nudge and a salute to a specific community, ethos, and political movement. It is a disavowal of game as a viable heuristic category, even as the phrase lyric game persists as a sign beneath which to gather with those who share these artistic commitments.
And we point out this shifting rhetoric not to challenge these accounts, quite the opposite. The fact is, this is no contradiction. The lyrical here is not a label, not a genre, not an ontology, but a refusal of such things. It embodies a playful relation to the need to be legible at all.
As PB scans the page, the many ochre eyes of an eel-like fish stare back at her. The painting has been carefully positioned so that the creature, bent into playful cartilaginous squiggles, is only seen from above. Yet PB knows that underneath its rubbery mouth are orbital rows of teeth. PB realizes that, as rendered, the creature has seemingly latched onto the page itself. If the page were a fish, it would be having its flesh torn by the hooked tongue of this adorable, horrible, all-devouring parasite.
PB holds two games in her hands. The first is the core rulebook of a well-known fantasy role-playing game. The second, which features the aforementioned creature on the cover, is Richard Kelly's Universal Parasitic RPG supplement game Lamprey. Lamprey latches onto the core rulebook of another RPG. From there, players are instructed to tear pages from the host text. As the lamprey slowly feeds and the host wastes away entirely, the quiet in the room is suddenly punctuated by the sound of a page torn from its binding.
Lyrical play is an investment in creative unmaking. It is not contained by any game, but instead hemorrhages the very grammatology of games as a genre. In this way, lyric is a prepositional troubling that operates much like trans does. Neither are nouns, but unraveling verbs. The doublespeak of lyric game designers who simultaneously disavow the existence of lyric games even as they sell their projects as lyric game bundles is a lesson in this prepositional troubling.
For the aspiring lyrical play scholar, we must learn to likewise revel in the messy shit, unstable, unwieldy, and imploding ontologies. To play lyrically is to be in playful relation, which means anticipating change, anticipating shifting, not being precious about where we will end up, not taking anything for granted and as an authority.
You can have a lyrical relation to any game, not just lyric games, so why not a lyrical relation to a gender, a subfield, a paper, a conference presentation?
Nestled in the corner of a board game cafe in Brooklyn, Percy narrates the descent of a friend's character, Emile, into the depths of an abandoned metro station. Percy is facilitating Laurie O'Connell's Lichcraft, in which Emile must gather the spell and ritual components necessary to become a lich so that he can survive the 300-year-long wait lists for an appointment at the gender clinic. As a group of ghosts materializes around a hidden fortune, the coins and bills that will grant Emile immortality, the player stops the session and says, "Can I be honest with you? If I got this money, I wouldn't do the ritual or become a lich at all." I just opened my own gender clinic. After a pause, he continues. But we can still do the session you prepped.
In this moment of play, Lichcraft's rules and premise can no longer hold. After encouraging us to prod at restrictive structures of mortality and morality, Percy and his player are brought inevitably to question the game's rigidity itself. In making his request to Percy, his friend has stopped playing by the rules of Lichcraft and instead expresses his desire for something beyond what the game's fiction has imagined, a world where trans people have money to open their own clinics and therefore don't need to become undead wizards.
In other words, he has started to play lyrically, with a spirit of exceeding this game that cannot contain all of the impulses and desires that its fiction elicits. Lichcraft makes living and waiting playful, and the lyrical play it inspires in turn makes the vessel of the game itself unbearable. The game welcomes its own destruction.
Play recontextualizes objects. Spells become game rules become fish food, gender transition becomes an arcane ritual. This recontextualization makes space for transformation and discovery that would be impossible if we were not open to destruction in the same breath as creation, to letting go of things even as we reach for others. We name this embodiment a trans, playful, lyrical mode.
If trans life challenges gender as a stable and coherent object, what kinship does that have with how lyric games challenge game as a stable and coherent object? What happens when we let go of needing stable and coherent objects at all? We might take a reminder here from Ada Mendez's collectible trading moon game. Everything is playable, even the moon.
In our call for building playful relations to our field's central objects, inspired by lyric games and the play they elicit, queer analog and game become the transforming rituals of our play rather than the fences of our playground.
So let us together turn our teeth on the rules we've inherited and the games we've been given. Let us privilege the acts of writhing, yearning, making, and unmaking over the fantasy of that which would name and contain us. What we need now is not coherence, but an unruly lyrical chorus, not permanence, but a politics of play that embraces flux, contradiction, and affective resonance. Lyrical play is not a method or a model, it is a practice of unbecoming, a spell, a breath, a tear in the page, a moon fight, a wish made aloud to the candles and the dark, knowing it may never be answered and making it anyway.
We depart from this ritual not with a framework, but with a field of possibility. To play lyrically is to linger with the unfinished, to trace the outlines of games that don't exist yet, to sit with the ache of what trans and queer life makes necessary, transformation. It is a crooked, joyful invitation to play with our scholarship as we play with games, messily and together.
And so we do not build a field. We scatter seeds in the open field beyond the playground, unsure of what might grow. We name nothing. We begin again.
The witches gather beyond the playground, writhing in the open field. The ground forgets its firmness.
Their bodies blur to verse, and the moon is devoured until only liches and lampreys remain. Thank y'all for being here. If you would like to read the full thing, it is published somehow already now at Analog Game Studies, and you can find it at the QR code here.
It was magical. Thank y'all so much. Next up is Shay. Shay, take it away, please.
Give me just a second and I will get my much more limited production up and running. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Che. I am a grad student. I finished my master's actually in between submitting for this conference and presenting here today, so I'm really glad to have done that. Started my PhD in the fall. But but just thrilled to be here. Yeah. And today I'm going to be talking about 2 RPGs, each of which draws, as I see it, a connection between punk aesthetics, queer sexuality, and extreme violence. I'm obviously going to be talking about both of them in detail in just a moment, but to start with some basic facts, the games I'm going to be describing today are Dungeon Bitches and Praise the Hawkmoth King. Dungeon Bitches was written by Emily Allen, aka Cave Girl. It was released in 2021. Praise the Hawkmoth King has just come out this year. It's still only partially available. Bits and pieces of it are being uploaded to itch. But it was written by a designer called Sage the Anagogue. And these games are linked and also distinguished by a number of things, which of course I'm going to talk about through the paper. But I do want to begin with both Sage and Emily's respective insistences that players approach playing each of these games with caution. Sage puts it pretty bluntly in Hawkmoth when she tells us that you should be prepared that you may get hurt while playing this game. Emily tells us in the introduction to Dungeon Bitches that, quote, if you go into this game without proper safety tools, you are frankly fucking irresponsible. And before I move past that, I do want to say that when I wrote the first draft of this paper, I almost described that second quote as Emily going a step further than Sage does. But I'm not actually 100% sure that that's the case. I'm not particularly interested in comparing the games in this way, but I do think some of the questions I want us to keep in mind as I move through this include what does it mean to go further? What does it mean to participate in Extremity? Where are the edges and envelopes that we might be pushing? And then do extreme aesthetics always correlate with political extremity? But these games are hard, they're loud, they're messy, they're violent, they are in your face. They're also deeply unapproachable. I think these are all qualities of punk. And I hope that the designers would agree with me. To go with the 2 games, I've brought 2 approaches that I just want us to keep in mind today. The first is the work of Sarah Ahmed in The Cultural Politics of Emotion. There, she describes the ways in which queer pleasures, quote, may generate discomfort in spaces that remain premised on the pleasures of heterosexuality. Discomfort for Ahmed is a sense of displacement and hyper-awareness of the self and the body at a disjoint from the patterns of the world around you. While normative actions, heteronormative actions, I should say, tend to shape the body and then naturalize their handiwork, queer feelings and arrangements invite us to reshape ourselves without allowing things to become settled in this way, reminding us that we are somehow at odds with the world. These reshapings are not essentially liberatory. Ahmed's readings of both queer pleasures and queer pains marks how each may be used either to support or contest the dominance of the heterosexual nuclear family. And I think in the 20 years since The Cultural Politics of Emotion was first published, the fundamental toothlessness of commercialized queer art, which Ahmed calls attention to, has only become more apparent. Queer feelings are then ambivalent, both in the sense of containing both pleasure and pain, and also in a variable relationship to a broader queer politics. The second approach, which I want to bring in here, is game designer Meg Baker's distinction between nobody gets hurt and I will not abandon you playstyles and approaches to safety. Meg has been talking and writing about this much longer than I've been critically interested in games, and I'm sure that there are ways in which her perspective has changed over time, which I'm about to entirely gloss over. But the basic distinction is that in nobody gets hurt approaches, we set the limits of play right just shy of people's boundaries. If a boundary is crossed or a button is pushed, the community of play which holds us together is fractured, and we can expect that people will disengage. Meanwhile, in an I will not abandon you framework, we invite players, or we invite each other as players rather, to intentionally push each other's limits and nevertheless to remain engaged with one another as we work through the patches of difficult feeling and messy reaction which may result. Neither of these playstyles is essentially better than one another or than the other, but when we engage in play without articulating which we're leaning into, we're just waiting to run into tension when our expectations differ. To bring these approaches together, I think that the avoidance of pain remains an extremely sturdy social norm in RPG spaces. The popularity of particular pain avoidance safety tools speaks to this. And to be clear, I understand that 100%. I have played enough miserable games at conventions to understand that the ability for players to unilaterally withdraw is really important, even if it is a betrayal in an I will not abandon you mindset. But if we can only articulate the value of games and the value of safety as the avoidance of pain, we don't leave any room for games like Dungeon Bitches or like Hawkmoth King, which tell us at the outset that we're likely to get hurt. To understand these games, as with, I think, so much of queer art and so much of punk culture, we have to be able to understand that discomfort, disruption, and pain are also sites of really significant pleasure. Which brings me to a brief aside. It's very fun to do this presentation in a lineup with other people because I think other people have already kind of touched on this, but I don't know. I just want to say it and then move on. For folks who have already been around for for folks who have been around rather for certain moments in discourse around game design and safety, there's a similarity between what I'm describing here and comparisons which sometimes get made between games and sex, and particularly between safety in games and safety in kink. I just want to say, and this really isn't the point of my paper, but I think that RPG safety tools are like kink is one of those clever statements which gets made sometimes. It's a little bit like actual play is porn, which has already come up, which I don't want to discard out of hand, but which I think is probably not being made or taken as seriously as it deserves most of the time when it's being made. It's telling to me that RPG safety tools are like kink is something that's only said in one direction. I don't know. Maybe there are people in the leather community who are saying things like, wow, kink is just like an X card. And if that is you, please get in touch. You fascinate me. But for what it's worth, I think RPG safety, pardon me, I jumped back. Oh no, I didn't jump back. I just repeated that phrase. For what it's worth, I think RPG safety tools are like kink is a joke, and it's often made without a real working knowledge of safety, especially in kink spaces. And I think, like the porn to actual play comparison, if it's a comparison which we're going to make and take seriously, we should make it and take it seriously and engage with more thoughtfully than what usually happens. Both these games are going to make that comparison, and I think that should be studied, and that's not quite what I'm doing here today. Move on to the games themselves. Dungeon Bitches. Dungeon Bitches is a visually overwhelming game. I have some of the art up here on the slide. This panel is pretty tame for a lot of what ends up on the page. There's definitely less visible intestines on this page than in most spreads. But the itch page for Dungeon Bitches calls it a medieval riot girl zine, and I think that that's a really interesting touch point. This is a game where the visuals are going to hit you first, the aesthetics are going to hit you first, and part of what happens in reading the book is that what you're meant to feel is conveyed first by the image and then only later by the words. Together, though, these words and these pictures convey a big, messy game about queer women pushed out from society, living on the edge of an extremely violent underculture, breaking themselves and breaking their bodies in what the game calls harrowing but hot dungeons. The game is understandably intense and also extremely upfront about the need for safety tools. We get 7 spreads, 14 straight pages of guidance on how to play the game safely. Guidance which revolves around making sure that people have control over what they're getting into and how they want to get back out of it. You can see some of this guidance here. There's a list of content warnings on the left side of the page. Emotional trauma, sexism, homophobia, religious discrimination, graphic violence, romance, and sex are all on the list of what cannot be eliminated from the game, while further religious themes, the weaponization of sex, social privilege, and body horror are all places that the game could easily go if you're interested in that. If you're not interested, or if there are parts of the core pitch which you simply don't want to bring to the table, it is perfectly fine to say that Dungeon Bitches isn't for you. Following this spread, like I said, there are 6 more spreads. Introductions to common safety tools, lines and veils, X cards, and then also some instructions, suggestions on how to scaffold discussion, debriefs, and aftercare, which, again, Dungeon Bitches term, of course, emerges from the language of kink. What we have then in Dungeon Bitches is 2 suggestions for maintaining safety. Preventative tools like lines and veils, and then mid and after game escape valves, which allow us to safely get out of the places that we need to leave behind. In this, Dungeon Bitches centralizes what we could describe as a nobody gets hurt approach to play, at very least in its explicit text. And this makes, to me, some degree of sense, given that underneath the visual excess and the dark fantasy and the violence and the intestines and the homophobia, Dungeon Bitches is actually a pretty optimistic game, especially when it comes to the healing potential of queer women in relationship with each other. Although there are certainly spaces in the game for harm, power imbalances, and conflict between players, it's also broadly the case that the enemies and the threats are out there in the world, while we are, for the most part, on each other's sides. This is not the case in Hawkmoth King. Praise the Hawkmoth King is a kind of tricky game to critically discuss, in part because it's so new and it's changing so quickly. I wrote part of this presentation on an airplane home from Michigan, and while I was in the air, I was legitimately worried that Sage was going to release some new chunk in that like hour-and-a-half span, and I would have to start reading and writing all over again. But to begin with the kind of one-to-one comparison, Hawkmoth King is still in a kind of ashcan prototype chapter 1 format, which means that while there's some gorgeous cover art and some layout through the game, the text is for the most part much plainer than that of Dungeon Bitches. You can see here on the top right, that is Hawkmoth Chan, a little horrible mascot for the game who pops up throughout the text and gives terrible and often transphobic advice about how to manipulate the game and take advantage of your fellow players. Which brings us maybe, or demonstrates the deeper difference between Praise the Hawkmoth King and Dungeon Bitches, which is that where I described the former as broadly optimistic about the possibilities for restorative queer communities on the edge, Hawkmoth King is clear time and again that this is a game about hurting one another and a game in which we are on some level playing against one another. Instead of lines or veils, we get another comically long list of content warnings, which you can see at the bottom here, but which Sage also describes as a list of tantalizing promises. And then a passage in which Sage writes that this is a game meant for an experienced group of players with a lot of trust between them. This is a game for experienced kinksters, people who understand how to apply and utilize negotiation, safe words, and aftercare. While this game is not itself a sexual activity, it is a game about extremely taboo sex, and it may stir sexual feelings inside of you during play. You should be prepared that you may be hurt while playing this game. This is true of all games, of course, but it is especially true of this one. I cannot protect you from getting hurt. Please play mindfully and be aware of the ways in which this game may put you on edge or work you into a tizzy. Sex and sexual violence is not incidental or accidental to Hawkmoth King, and to be entirely clear, I don't think that it is in Dungeon Bitches either, but the approach taken here is distinct. Rather than recognizing that the premise of the game has taken us beyond the mainstream limits of what can appear at the table, and then inviting safety tools to stop us from going too far, Hawkmoth King takes our going too far as an inevitability, reminding us only to be mindful and exercise good care, to be ready to respond when our bodies are moved, whether in pleasure or in pain. This is I Will Not Abandon You play with a strong dose of Ahmed's ambivalent queer feelings. This is a game which asks you before you play to recognize that you are at risk of being hurt and of hurting others. That is the pleasure of playing it, a queer dislocation which allows us to reshape our bodies across the traditional social norms of victim and perpetrator and take pleasure in that. Again, it is no surprise that Hawkmoth King specifically evokes kink, and while it's certainly possible that you could come at it from a different philosophy, I don't think nobody gets hurt is where the emphasis of the text stands. To wrap up, I do want to step back from the obvious next step of continuing to measure these games against each other. There's a temptation here to cast an easy binary to tell you which of these games is good and which one is bad, or which is more queer or more punk or more artistic or whatever. But I don't think that that line of criticism is even a little bit useful. More interesting to me is the tensions which unite these games, the tensions which spring from their fundamental unapproachability. Both Dungeon Bitches and Hawkmoth King are clear about the fact that they're not for everybody. They're not trying to be for everybody. They aren't playing for the widest possible consumer base, but they're rather making artistic statements for a much more specific audience. And yet, you can buy these games, you can download them, you can do whatever you want with them. You can hurt yourself or your friends with them, and not just in a pleasurable way, but in an act of actual violence. And there is fundamentally nothing that Sage or Emily could do to prevent that. This, to me, is very punk. It's the tension of a culture which attempts to stand against consumerism, but which is predicated on consumer media forms. It's the tension of a culture which attempts to wear its politics on its sleeve, but which finds them co-opted or diluted time and time again. And this is where Ahmed is really most pressing for me, right? Because the concern that queer feelings of both pleasure and of pain might be co-opted or commodified to support a heterosexual empire is present here, as is the specter of the Nazi punk. That games are, at the end of the day, unable to finally defend themselves against misuse is perhaps the most punk thing about them. And yet, they try, right? This is the paradox of queer art and the paradox of punk. To lean into violence, to push into extremity, and to surface queer feelings, and therefore to hammer home the unapproachability of our art allows games to resist the dilution of their politics. And yet it is also this same unapproachability which makes them cool and which makes them objects for commodification and co-option. Or, alternatively, which makes them alienating and which sets the stage for them to be forgotten absolutely. If punk is not yet dead, it is certainly killing itself over and over and over again. And if this seems like a grim reading of the future of queer art, it may be, but it's that tension, that discomfort, that invitation to reshape and be reshaped across lines of pleasure and pain, which allows queer art, allows punk art to articulate our own uncertain positions in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shay. That went hard. So, congratulations, everybody. That was an amazing, awesome set of papers. And now we're going to transition into the Q&A. And already, right? So if y'all want to share, but I have some questions already for Megan, and they're pretty similar. So I'll read out both Jay, hi Jay, and Anonymous. So Jay asked you, Megan, what was the racial makeup of the men you spoke with? I'm really curious about the way it seems masculinity is getting racialized, such as the high quality of half-orcs and barbarians in particular. Did you notice any particular way race and blackness in particular appeared or was modeled in how characters were constructed? And this kind of does like fall into the second question of like of how Anonymous asks you, can you please elaborate on why you chose only male identifying participants for the research? I am curious about non-binary and female identifying research participants, perspectives on masculinities, and whether there is overlap among players' gender identities and masculine character development. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if you don't mind, I think I'll take the second one first. So we wanted to, in our study, kind of reproduce methodologically a thing that a lot of the previous studies had done, which was to talk to people about exploring their own identities through role play, as opposed to like imagining a different identity category that, you know, they might not like identify with or experience. We actively recruited and tried to get trans men to join our study. And we had a few who responded saying that they were interested, but were unwilling to participate on a Zoom interview because they were really worried about the potential for being outed, even though they were reassured, like, we are not using anyone's names, we're not using any video footage. Like, they just were really uncomfortable with the idea of being recorded in any way for the purpose of being transcribed, which totally understandable. But that would definitely be something we're interested in pursuing in the future. We also had a few folks who identified as non-binary who volunteered to participate, and we ended up sending them the research questions because a lot of them center around asking things like, you know, where did you learn about what it means to be a man, and what are some things in your everyday life that make you feel like make you feel masculine? And we asked them, like, you know, we'd love to have you in the study if you're comfortable with that, but, you know, this is what the questions we're going to be asking about. Would you like to answer these questions? And the couple of respondents who we did that with said, actually, no, I don't think that this really matches me. And so they were generous and said, hey, when we're ready to do the next study, which is going to be asking women to talk about, or people who identify as women to talk about what it would mean to make a character that exemplifies femininity, and then asking folks that are non-binary to talk about making a character that exemplifies what it means to be non-binary. So those people are like lined up for us basically for future studies, if that makes sense. But yeah, we were interested in people exploring the gender that they identify as through the mechanics of play. That said, though, I do think it would be really interesting to do a study that goes the other way, right? That asks women to make a character that exemplifies masculinity or vice versa. Like that could be really interesting. And then in regards to the racial makeup of our study, we very purposefully didn't want to, how do I want to say this? We didn't want to I'll say it this way. A lot of our recruitment that we did was in our local area, and our study group reflects that, is how I'll say it. So there was a lot of white identifying participants and a lot of Hispanic identifying participants in West Texas. We didn't have any participants who identified as Black, and I think that would maybe require some more targeted recruitment than we were able to do with the difference between our local recruitment and then our snowball sampling recruitment. But I do think that, especially given the themes that emerged in our study, where people started talking about species as a role-playing mechanic and how that read onto their gender, or their performance of gender, that really made it clear to us that, you know, intersectionality is a big part of this question, and that you know, maybe this needs to be something that we do some specific recruitment for in the future. It's also tough when you're doing interviews, like you want to make the interviews short enough that people are willing to participate. And so I imagine maybe some more focused interviews in the future about some of those intersectional issues would be useful to do, and would reveal some really interesting results.
Thank you so much, Megan. Also on the Q&A, I have a question for PB and Percival. Well, Louise says, as a trans game designer trying to understand my peers making lyrical games, is there a concern that it too will become watered down after reaching past the niche of trans and queer people? Is it an accepted inevitability?
I have so many thoughts about this. Do you want to go first, though, Percy? Because once I start, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to stop. So I need you to rein me in.
I mean, I think part of the thing that PB and I are thinking about is that I think it is, I don't want to claim that lyric games are like immune to co-optation or whatever, because I don't know that I could claim that anything is, but I also am sort of like, because it's sort of defined in the negative in certain ways, like I actually don't know that watering down is possible, because I think if something is trying to like imitate the lyrical without actually like embodying the sort of values that classify a lyric game insofar as it can be classified, like I think it will become immediately evident that it's actually not really doing what lyric games are doing, and or if something is not doing what lyric games are currently doing, like that's also fine. Like I think it is such an unpinnable thing that I don't know that I would be concerned about that risk. And I also like, yeah, I don't know. PB, you go.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I really appreciate this question. So thanks, Louis, because this brings up something that comes up anytime I'm talking about my work more broadly about quote unquote unplayable games, which is my area of research. And something that I really want to drive home here is that I think Percy and I are much less interested in lyric game as a genre than we are in lyrical relationships to games as a practice. One of those things, of course, can be co-opted, of course, can be watered. I mean, go to itch and in the little category section, type in lyric game and see what you get. Like, there is something to be said there about it's smart marketing, it's, you know, all these things. And will there come a day when major presses, who I won't name here on a recorded thing, are publishing things and calling them lyric games to boost that SEO? Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the whole point that Percy and I are kind of driving home here, is that a lyrical relationship to play and games is completely disinterested in cultivating or maintaining that. Fundamentally, we don't care. And a part of the reason I think that's so important is for us, the analog there to transness is really important, where one could argue that trans is something that gets co-opted, whether that's the way that algorithms treat us or the way that we end up getting represented in media. And it's like, oh, is this a good trans game? Is it not? And I actually really appreciated that the folks on this panel were very disinterested in maintaining those kinds of rigid categories. Instead, we might see transness as having a fugitive relationship to those kinds of ontologies. And I think for us, this same idea comes back to play, where a lyrical relationship to play has kind of a fugitive relationship to capital G gaming, is what I would argue here.
I might also add quickly to lift up something from the Discord that Jay Dragon pointed out. Lichcraft is in fact not a lyric game. And we maybe should have said explicitly, but also sorry that I'm holding back the cat. Lichcraft is not a lyric game in its marketing. The designer does not call it a lyric game. He has never used the word lyric game in a relationship to it, but every single time I've played it with any trans person, immediately they're like, oh, can we push back on this rule and can we do this differently? Can we reinterpret this? And I'm like, oh, that's a lyrical relationship to this game. So we might think about what games can afford in terms of like, when are my desires as a player exceeding what the game can conceive of?
Thank you so much for your response. I figured out I can ask through a question through the Q&A, so I'm gonna put my question for Keerthi on the chat, and I'd like to reiterate it. I asked to you, I would like to know your thoughts on this, your talk about sex and TTRPGs play session reminds me how YouTubers and online content creators stream their play of queer games and playing with queer relationships. When they do it, it's usually made into a joke or not taken seriously, or the communities that don't take it seriously. For example, Dream Daddy, I hate it. But it's also spotlights queerness and queer possibilities. Is this similar to what you see in your research? How do we contend with these tensions when queer intimacies are made a spectacle through these platforms? How can we refang queer radical intimacies through spectating, if at all? I'm sorry, it's a multi-layered question, but you could take it apart however you want.
Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Yeah, neoliberalism is a curse. I think, and I think that when we're looking at that specific kind of YouTuber parasociality, my friend Kevin Garvey coined the term para-community specifically for sort of Twitch chat communities, and I think that like queerness as performance takes on an added layer when you're looking at sort of inhabiting video game space and orienting, Sarah, I'm at time again, oneself in relation to that video game space through the Twitch frame, which is another liminal frame. I'm full of them, guys. But I think it's the contrast and the tension between the spotlighting and the possibility and the I think that the issue there is the flattening of queerness and the defanging, as you're implying in the structure of your question as well, this idea of like, I know a fair amount of Sims YouTubers, build mode YouTubers that will openly make videos about like pride packs and add-ons to the base game, and specifically Sims Twitch streamers that will have storms of people in chat saying, add the pride flag, like make this a lesbian room, and that's a sort of community fronting of queerness that I think is joyful. And another, I'm going to talk for 8 hours if you guys let me. It's also like nearly 10 p.m. where I am, so there's no there's no Ritalin to keep this in check. But I think another aspect of this that is really important to me is that a lot of the time when we're talking about these audiences, we're talking about kids, we're talking about teenagers, we're talking about queer teens, and if queer teens' first interaction or one of their first interactions with queerness is Julian Solomita playing Life is Strange True Colors, I am happy with that. I have no notes for that, so I think, and I feel the same about actual play and, the prevalence of actual play giants like Dropout, for example, fronting queerness and fronting transness in very explicit ways to the best of their ability and within the constraints and systems that I was talking about, as ways of spotlighting that queerness. And I think that there is space for both, essentially, right? There is space for, hey, we should really think about this in critical ways and stop uncritically consuming. And also like, well, a 15-year-old should uncritically consume to to some degree, and they're going to, regardless of if they should. So to sort of, yeah, I hate moralizing.
No, thank you so much for your response. There's a question asked by Matt, and I would like for Che to answer it first. And Matt asks, he says, a fantastic panel with excellent speakers. You guys were. I'm interested in hearing the speakers unpack the relationships between queer experiences, trauma, and humor a little bit more, but as though there are elements of this across the latter three papers within your work, practice, and research. Shay, can you start?
Yeah, I'm really glad to get to answer this one because so I come to game studies by way of the field of religious studies, and sort of one of my big questions is what are the similarities maybe between religious behaviors and playful behaviors? And for me, one of the big similarities is that both the sacred and the playful let us do things which with maybe a layer of distance, right? We're able to say, well, I wouldn't do this in my real life, but you have to understand, God told me to, and so that's defensible. Or I wouldn't do this in my real life, but you have to understand, this isn't real life. This is casual, playful space. And so, I think one of the really interesting things is that like trauma in many ways becomes like the stand-in for like the worst of all possible things in kind of where we're at, not where all of us are at necessarily, but like in one particular way of thinking about the person and what your life looks like and how you grow and change. It's like, well, you have these traumas which happen to you, and then you get away from them, and the longer your life goes on, the fewer traumas happen in it, hopefully. And so one of the things that really started me thinking about these games was playing sessions in which we got to tap on each other's traumas a little bit, right? A lot of this, the game doesn't end up coming up in my paper, but a lot of my thinking about these games where we're kind of playing with hurting each other really came from a session of Bluebeard's Bride that I played maybe last October, where we had done a couple of sessions and we couldn't really get the game to click. And then a friend and collaborator of mine put together an all trans femme session, and we said like, well, we're gonna make this game about like reliving each of our worst experiences, and it was incredible. It made the game sing in a way that I really struggled to like get at what was kind of in the text of that book. And so I think humor works in a similar way, right? That when we say it as a joke, what we are saying is it is playful, and so we're in this kind of other world, this world of the unreal. And obviously, check back in 5 years when I finished the PhD about whether or not I think that the sacred and the playful are actually the same thing. There are differences there, but it's really, I guess this all circles around to like it is helpful to have an object through which you can distance yourself from a thing in order to reenact it, right? To get that skin of unreality between yourself and the action, and then also to recognize the ways in which like you're pulling yourself back into it. I want to be re-traumatized. I want to feel the way that it felt to feel at a certain, like, I don't know. It's messy and it's tough to articulate, but don't know if I answered anything. But there we are.
No, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in?
I'll jump in quickly just to say that I think something that's maybe also understated in this question, but something I have been thinking about a lot. It's just how the lived experiences of queer people shape our relationships to the table and our play groups, and how for many of us, that's perhaps a thing that pushes us to think about design or scholarship or whatnot. I know for myself, like that's a big part of the reason I am here at all. The first big paper I ever wrote about tabletop role-playing games and queerness was me trying to make sense of a horrible table that I was at, having an utter meltdown and being like, why was I the only one uncomfortable here? What the hell was going on? And I think that this is this is something that ends up being integral to so many uh, designers and creators and academics is where do we find productive space to explore like those anxieties and feelings and whatnot. Not to like shameless plug, but as a like an example here, at the end of next month, knock on wood, hopefully, I'm putting out a game that's very specifically coming out uh, that I've been building from the premise of an anxiety that is, why is it post transition people suddenly stop reaching out to play games with me in certain contexts? And so this is a game that you play when your regular scheduling for your session falls through. And it's a decryption game where you have to take the messages your friends have sent canceling section and figure out what kind of alien or extra dimensional being has actually body snatched your friend, which is the real reason your session is getting canceled. For me, I think it's all about that opportunity to take whether those are our traumas, these as Che was saying, these little moments in our own personal experiences. How do we make them playful in a way that gives us a degree of agency to like actually handle them, perhaps in a way that we weren't able to at the time we experienced them the first go around? Those are some not well theorized rambly thoughts, but
Can I offer one of my favorite theorists, but it's not Lauren Berlant, to that makes me think of, which is Talia Betcher wrote this article in 2019 called What is Trans Philosophy, where she's arguing basically like trans philosophy is clarifying rather than creating perplexity, because like philosophy as a field often wants to create perplexity. And she basically is like the lived experience of trans people, she calls it the what the fuck, and is like we're all moving from a place of attempting to like figure out what the fuck, as in like um oh, I have to contact 3 different doctors to get letters in order to access like the healthcare that I need in order to live. What the fuck? And I think that for me is a driving force of like all of the work that I do as well, is like I'm trying to answer that question about myriad lived experiences that I've had.
Thank you so much. I know my co-host B wants to ask a question and point out some things. B, can you take it away?
Hi, yeah, I wanted to draw attention to Megay Baker's questions. So what Meg is saying is she wants to sort of do a clarity check because it's very easy for a recording to become definitive. So and I especially wanted to ask Che's perspective on how no one gets hurt and I will not abandon you are descriptive after the fact that a game is played and not prescriptive tenets. That's also really important to me in my work, and I wondered if you had, if Che and anyone else before we had has any thoughts on that and how things have changed or stayed the same in safety spaces.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw Meg's comments and I heard myself stumble over it when I said it out loud. But yeah, I think one of the things I often struggle with in game spaces, I think also coming from maybe a more anthropological discipline, is this extent to which like I am always like, well, you know, I'm writing about what other people do, and I'm not providing guidelines for how you could do this. You go and, you know, make your own religions, right? But yeah, I want to be 100% clear. Nobody gets hurt. I will not abandon you are play cultures and practices which develop and which are helpful to articulate, because if you aren't conscious of the differences in play practices and in and in expectations around safety, what's going to end up happening, and what does end up happening, is that people come together with different play practices, and then communities fall apart. And I think this is part of what I'm trying to get at with my maybe pessimistic reading of like what is punk. Lauren Berlant came up, right? This idea that we have an underculture, which are all going to be unified, and we're all going to be politically cohesive, and we're all going to have this wisdom to share with each other, is a fantasy. And in the moments when you expect for kind of full, there should be kind of full communion happening. Those are the moments when the community is going to end up fragmenting and breaking apart. And differences in approaches to safety are helpful, I think, in understanding why that happens, rather than like, I mean, I guess, and then as a second step, it's like helpful to know that that might happen in a community you're in. But like, this is in no way me saying, if we all embraced a certain style of play, there would never be any problem at the table again, right? It is always about the way in which aesthetics and fantasized publics and communities have enough flexibility inside of them that they can hold multiple things, and we don't realize that there's maybe a plurality inside of a or not even a plurality, but rather polyvocality inside of a group, until the moments when like it all explodes and suddenly, you're crying in a convention center because you just had the worst game of your life. Yeah.
Hey, everybody.
Oh, you go.
Oh, no, I will go. Yeah, sorry. That's time. I think we did an amazing job. This was a very powerful set of presentations. All y'all did amazing. I know we couldn't get to everyone's questions because, time is a performance, right? But y'all all are welcome to take your questions to Discord and continue the conversations. And for the next 30 minutes, we'll be on break. But thank you so much for presenting, and stay analog. Bye, everyone.